funny that I'm speaking here because back a long time ago when I was thinking about what I want to do when I grow up, I grew up in Baldwin Hills and went to Audubon Junior, then went to the west, then moved to the west side, and got exposed to a lot of things. So I was really interested in being some sort of combination of oceanographer, lawyer, and thinking about all the things that would be happening by now under the sea, most of which are still waiting to happen, as Jerry was talking about under the sea. But along the way, I flunked out of law school, so that sort of killed that part of the whole thing. Though that turned out to be one of the better lines I had when I was running for office and when I was talking to small business groups. So it all works out. And I had the pleasure of serving the legislature when then Assemblyman, now Congressman Sam Farr, represented Monterey Bay Aquarium specifically in that whole area. And Sam, very close friend, and spent many, many wonderful hours with him and his family in Monterey, and also going through the aquarium in Monterey, but also talking about marine protection, which is very near and dear to Sam's heart. And so add that to being a diver, occasional diver, and general interest in oceans, so I'm glad to be here. But I wanted this one put back up because I think there's a piece of that's missing in this analysis of it, and that's what I wanted to talk about. As Jerry mentioned, my assembly district when I got elected was the north and east San Fernando Valley. And so that means pretty much east of the 405 freeway and north of Roscoe. So Coima, Arleta, San Fernando, Sylmar, Mission Hills, Granada Hills, Sepulveda, a little bit north of Hollywood, we're all in that area. And the reason I mentioned it, particularly in this context, is I'll never forget, I'd been in office, I guess maybe the first or second year, not even term, but year, and I got approached by some folks who said, we'd like to start a program to take kids to the beach. That seems sort of reasonable, kids go to the beach all the time. Well, apparently, little did I know, not in Coima. And the reason I bring it up is there were tons of kids. We did that for all 16 years I was in the legislature. Whenever community groups would do, we recruit buses, we find buses, we take kids, they go to the beach, they go to the pier, they do a whole thing. Because these teachers were all explaining to me that first time, these are kids that have never seen the ocean. Now you think about it, as we sit here at the ocean, all of you heavily involved with marine activity, obviously, and all the great things this facility does, but we're growing up generations of people who have never seen the ocean. Not just from a marine biology standpoint, but it starts explaining at least how, you say, how come you can't visualize, or why don't you have a bigger vision, or why don't you see more for yourself, or why don't you see more expansion? And you talk to somebody who's always lived in any urban core and never seen anything as vast as the ocean, or as wide, or as open, and you begin to understand how they may have a very different perspective of this thing they've heard about, and now probably have seen on videos or cell phones or whatever it is, but still haven't put their feet in the water and don't understand, don't comprehend. And so it begins to impact how you view individuals and what their opportunities are to learn. So before we can get to a place where you can create a movement or support for a lot of what Kingdom was talking about in terms of these policies, you gotta have an understanding of what we're talking about and why that's important. And if you go back to kids that are growing up and have never seen the ocean, have been out of an area other than an urban setting, that whole ability to dream big and see big and think big has been restricted just by their circumstances and their lack of exposure to opportunities, ideas, but also just big sky and ocean, big water. And so we started doing that program, and as I said, we did it every year for 16 years. And there were thousands of kids that went through that who we hope that through that and through their teachers, at least came away from it with an opportunity to think there is more out there. I can see beyond the graffiti, or I can see beyond the tagging, or beyond this, or beyond that. And there's another whole world out there that we want to challenge them to understand and explore. And that didn't all come from one bus trip, but hopefully it started something with some of those kids and at least exposed them to more. And I think as a whole, if we want to create the kind of political will to do things that are beneficial for the ocean clearly, but also start to look for ways that humans and the ocean can collaborate, if you will, together in a sustainable and safe way, first you have to have folks that understand what's going on and what the possibilities are, or just the opportunity. And so education is a huge piece of this. And it's one of the reasons why in Pacoima, we championed some of the first charter schools at LA Unified. And, we have a principal there named Yvonne Chan, who took the first charter school as an elementary. And that would have been probably in the mid-'80s, maybe early '90s. That elementary school is now grown into, there's an charter elementary, charter middle school, charter high school. There's a health clinic and health facilities because no one had access to health care. I mean, she created this whole community within Pacoima that gives kids an opportunity they've never had before. In fact, a long time, many years ago, she managed to put together some land behind there's a couple of abandoned houses, there were drug houses behind the school that had been finally shut down. She put together enough money to buy them. We bulldozed them on Columbus Day, and we had the kids. She put the kids together in ships, moving from the old school to where the new buildings were going to be, and it was literally, from drug house to classrooms, and education and new computer labs. So that kind of stuff is exciting. But my point is that people have to understand before you can enlist their help in solving the problem. I've been talking to a lot of groups. I do a lot of transportation stuff. That's what I did in the legislature. And I do a lot of it for the mayor down, as Jerry mentioned. And ever since we've been doing America Fast Forward, and we've got a plan to build 15 mass transit projects, 12 mass transit projects in 10 years, we're getting a lot of interest from the rest of the country in what we do. And I was speaking in Toronto not too long ago. They wanted me to come up there and explain to them how we did this and how they could do that. And then I found out that they have a city of, I think, 2.3 million people, and they have 1.3 million boardings on the bus each day. And I thought, maybe I should sit down and listen, because we've got, in the county, there's about 10 million people, and we're boarding about 1 million, so I think we can learn some lessons, at least I can learn some lessons from that. But they kept saying, what's the most important thing before we move forward to try and raise dollars to do this? And that's the most important thing, I think, is that the public agrees with the policymakers as to what the problem is. We can all sit around and identify problems because we all spend more time looking at it than most people do. So we can figure out the problems. But if you need solutions that require people to buy into the solutions, whether it's a ballot measure, whether it's an initiative, whether it's legislation, if they don't agree with you that's a problem, they're not going to be real anxious to solve it, particularly when there are problems everywhere that need to be solved. So a big part of this process, the piece I put before setting the agenda even, is the outreach to inform the public and begin educating the public. Because I think the other thing that's happened, and by the way, as I'm rambling on, as I tend to do, but feel free to ask questions, throw something at me, raise it. I want to keep it relatively informal and happy to answer your questions. So don't be shy. But what I said, identifying the problem, the education piece of it, is something that we need to do a better job of before people will come around to want to do something about it. And as I started to say, one of the things that's happened, I think, and this is fairly traditional in preservation movements, and it's fairly traditional in conservation movements, you have folks that buy into the notion that this needs to be protected and preserved. But once they buy into that notion, there's also the no acceptable use that can be done at the same time, which is the more sophisticated part of the education argument. On one hand, I'm talking about kids who have no idea what vast means. On the other hand, I'm talking about people who know a lot of stuff, but have been told, they got it in their brain that if they're going to preserve something like a pristine ocean or a pristine bay, and I sit on the board of Gila Bay, so we've done a little work on trying to clean up the bay in Santa Monica. Once they get the notion, though, that I'm preserving it, they also get the notion that can't touch it, can't do anything. There are no incompatible uses. And by definition, everything other than it being natural is an incompatible use, which doesn't get Jerry where you're trying to get to. So there's education that has to take place on both sides of it. On the younger end, through our schools and through trips to the aquarium and opportunities for kids to touch and see and feel. And then on the far other end of the extreme with policymakers who may think they've done the right thing by preserving something, but now trying to explain that sustainability doesn't mean necessarily that it just sits there in its natural state. Some things should, some things have to. But there's also areas like we're talking about aquaculture and activities like that that require a cooperation between people and the ocean and what lives in the ocean, and that those things can be done in a way that's very safe, that's very sustainable and appropriate, but that's a hard education lesson also for folks on the other end, particularly hardcore folks who want to just, I preserve it, it's pristine, don't do anything with it. So that sort of takes you in extreme. So the political process, which is confusing on a regular day, and I know all of you will be happy in about 12 days because your TVs will go back to being somewhat normal, whatever that, more normal than they are now. The radio waves, the robocalls will stop, your mailmen and women will no longer be stooping over because they're bringing those tons of mail that you want to take right to the trash can when they leave it in your mailbox. That's all going to be over in about 12 days. The results of what we all do will be felt for a long time to come. You know, the state of California, as you know, is going through significant budget crises. We are witnessing initiatives where people are spending, I finally figured out where the recovery is in this economy, because I don't know about you, but I keep hearing about it. I'm still looking for it. It's going to all the political campaigns, and everybody's buying TV time, because they've clearly recovered very well. Prop 32, which is viewed as a either pro-business or anti-labor kind of measure, depending on your point of view, will probably spend, both sides will probably spend 120 mil on that. We could educate a couple of people, create some marine sanctuaries, do a lot with 120 mil. That's just the one initiative. You know, then you get to all the rest of them, you know, and you have the Munger family feud playing out with Charles Munger putting money into right-wing causes and his sister, Molly Munger, bankrolling Prop 38 all on her own. You know, the opposite points of view. Take their family feud, go back to wherever you had it, but they'll spend tons of money. There's a ton of money in politics, but in order to get things on the ballot, in order to pass things, in order to get things before the public, there has to be that basic understanding of not only what is it you're trying to do, but why are you trying to do it? And that will also require some shifting and thinking, because you go back to the sort of pristine argument and the preservation argument, it's a mind shift to go from preservation to compatible uses. And that takes work. It takes work for folks who understand it. It takes a lot more work for people who have no background in it. And particularly when you're talking about the ocean, because the ocean still is, I think you probably agree, you know, it's the last great, not the last, but certainly the closest greatest still unexplored to a large extent opportunity, you know, that surrounds us. There's a lot we know about the oceans today. There's a lot more that we don't. And I think there's a world of opportunity. We already know that plants that grow in the ocean, just like plants that grow on the land, have great value for medical reasons, let alone food and sustainability reasons. There's a huge potential there. We have to make sure we do it right, and we have to make sure that we do it for the right reasons. But part of that is going to be just teaching people. And that, you know, Jerry, I know that's the hard part because you guys are ready to go. We were talking about, you know, just I refer to as your straw that you're putting into the ocean out there, so you don't have to truck in salt like that. You know, which only took you how long to get done?
About 2.5, 3 years. We're not done yet.
Which many people would tell you is actually fast in that process. You know, I know somebody that tried to negotiate a deal once with the Metropolitan Water District, and the private sector guys swore that they'd never done a deal that had taken that long, and the public sector guys at MWD swore they'd never done a deal that quickly, and they were both right. But it's just a different world. So public policy, in order to impact on it, you need to identify the issues. I would add to that list, before you set the agenda, unless you already know what your agenda is or your issue, you know, identify the issues that are the most important. And then also look at the issues that have a great chance of success in the beginning. Because I think it's important that anything like this, you need wins to pick up momentum. You know, you can't go out and change the world overnight, but you get pieces of it done that build on other pieces of it, that build on other pieces of it. And while that takes a lot longer than it should, you can't take the whole thing on at once. You got to find something, establish credibility, establish third-party validation for what you're doing, get people involved in the process. But at the end of the day, in order to be successful, it's got to be a vision that people can understand and buy into. And I talk about, you know, the process in that sense. People are key to it. You hear, for all the talk, you hear of special interest money, and there are gobs of it, untold gobs of it. And something which I think is very destructive to the democratic process. And process Democrat, not party. Though it would be destructive to the Democratic Party also, I think. But what's happened in elections in the last bunch of years in terms of the names of reform, you know, you'll be hearing a lot, or you've heard a lot about so-called 527 committees, or independent expenditure committees, or super PACs. And those are all ways to put money into campaigns without knowing where they come from. My day, you know, if I decided to call Jerry an idiot, other than being wrong, I'd have to take responsibility. Responsibility comes from sound effects. You know, or Jerry fights back. That's good. I like that. But at least there was a one-on-one conversation where I had to take responsibility for what I said, and that, I can live with that. People say whatever they want, but I just want you to say it to my face, and I'll do the same. Today, you don't know who's saying what about anybody, and by law, candidates can't have any involvement with independent expenditure committee. So some committee out there says, Jerry is whatever, vote for Richard. People come to me and say, well, how could you say that, Richard? I not only had nothing to do with it, by law, I'm precluded from having anything to do with it, so there's no accountability. Who do you hold accountable? Who do you ask? You may have seen a story that's been running the last 2 days about an $11 million donation that came in from Arizona, from a nonprofit in Arizona, into the committee, one of the committees opposing the governor's Prop 30, the school measure. $11 million. And because it comes from a nonprofit, they're able to do a large contribution once a year. Because it comes from a nonprofit, you don't know who the donors are. So there's $11 million worth of money in this one measure, opposing this measure, and we don't know who or where it comes from. I mean, we don't came from Arizona, but who knows where it started? Who knows who contributed to it? Who knows who's trying to influence our election? You know, there's a lot of that going on these days, and I think that reform is one of the most destructive things that's happened to participatory democracy in decades. And if it doesn't change, the system is going to collapse, I think, from it. Doesn't mean, though, that you can't make a difference. I tell folks that I am as idealistic today as I was when I first walked in the Capitol in 1980. This is the year that I was elected for 16 years, and this year I'll have been out for 16 years, which is sort of a frightening thing to think of 32 years like that. But I think I need a wheelchair. The other piece, though, while I'm idealistic still about one person's ability to make the difference, I'm not as naive about what it takes to make the difference as I was in 1980. But having been the single vote or watched things go up or down by one vote, you can make a difference. And I think with the legislature, members of Congress, people will respond if folks present things to them in a way that's understandable, organized, and has community support. But you do need to have to take it to them in a way that they can say, well, why should I go out on this? What's the difference to me? Or how does my district benefit, or my state benefit, or my city benefit? And that's where the education from things like the Aquarium here, and from school trips and developing new leaders, building that into kids and other people early enough. You know, what made the biggest difference in cutting down on smoking and littering? Not all the anti-smoking ads, not all, I mean, they made a huge difference, but not the biggest difference, and not all the campaigns around it all. It was when kids in elementary school came home and said, why are you littering? You know, why did you throw that out the car? My kid loves to point out everybody talking on a cell phone who shouldn't be, and he gets especially excited about it when it's a cop. You know, because I know we've all seen the cops on the subway, right, going down the street, pumping, and going, wait a minute. They get that stuff. You know, they don't have a lot of the barriers that we do. They just sort of accept it, like, yeah, that doesn't make any sense to throw that trash on the ground. It's just, why would somebody do that? And we found that when kids bought into something, they forced their parents, either through, you know, guilt, or, you know, just guilt works. Guilt works. But, you know, people respond. There was an experiment in Arizona. They had a program there called Kids Vote. And I had a similar bill to try and duplicate that here in California, but people vetoed it, unfortunately. The idea in Arizona that they started was they had mock elections in the classroom, but they talked about the elections in the elementary schools and the junior highs on the national stage or on the state stage. And the kids would actually vote with their parents to vote in little polling places next to big polling places, so they all went together. first positive out of that is you're teaching a generation the importance of voting before they get cynical about the whole thing. Most important part, turnout among adults where that program was being taught in schools was up 10% over similar areas where it wasn't being. So guilt works, you know, guilt works, not wanting to embarrass myself in front of my kid. That kind of stuff does work. And we need more of that in order to move marine protection or cooperation, maybe that's a better way to put it, to move that agenda forward. Because frankly, in the middle of everything else that's going on right now, folks tend to look at the ocean as something that's nice, it's tranquil for the most part. Like to look at it when it's tranquil or be in it when it's tranquil, not the other times. That's the fishermen in the group. But it's not something people think of as, from a preservation standpoint or even from an economic development standpoint. The notion that you can grow in the ocean and harvest in a sustainable manner is something that very few people, I think, certainly policymakers at this point, know much about or understand, because it's not something that gets promoted much. You have folks doing things and trying things, but for whatever reason, at least in California, from my experience, it's not something that people bring to legislators very often. And when they do, you're often competing with, I'm sorry, we're cutting $6 billion out of schools this week, and you come back next week, or we don't have enough money for police officers or health care or the program for healthy families for kids. All these things competing. So there needs to be third-party involvement, there needs to be private sector involvement, but it all, I think, needs to be done in cooperation with institutions like the Aquarium of the Pacific, because that's the only way we'll have credibility. I mean, if some private company comes out and says, listen, trust me, I just want to do this good little thing over here, just in the corner of that very forgiving ocean, as Jerry was saying earlier, and it'll all be okay, probably won't be, and no one's going to let them do it. But you need the cooperation, participation, and promoter of institutions that people know and trust, Scripps, the museum, the Aquarium of the Pacific, that have credibility in order to make that program something people want to get involved in. So it's a lot of background. You know, the legislative process itself is sort of boring. Policy committees on both sides, joint fiscal committees in both houses of the legislature. It really comes down to how you set your own priorities and how you want to communicate those to elected officials or people running for office. And the best time to get folks, is while they're running for office, because that's before they've gotten jaded or cynical or exposed to the forces of evil or whatever you want to call it. But that is a great time to get, those guys are, you go back to law enforcement units, right?
Yeah.
But you've seen those people. There's a way to make public policy happen, and it involves, it's not easy, and it's particularly in the state of special interest. Now, I don't know where Jerry is on this, but many, many years ago, I had this notion that there should be a law in California that precluded, I didn't think it was right to be displaying whales in parks, theme parks. I just never was comfortable with that whole notion. Not to mention they looked really big for that really small circle. It just didn't make any sense to me. And the opposition that came out of the woodwork on that, starting with Budweiser and all the folks in St. Louis, all the folks that fund all the places we all know, huge opposition. They kept saying, but we're doing good stuff because we're rescuing all these creatures that wouldn't be saved if we didn't rescue them. So were you rescuing them because they need rescuing, or are you rescuing them so you can rehabilitate them in your aquarium or your big cage down at something in San Diego or something like that? And we couldn't get it moved in the legislature because the opposition was so significant. And I got to tell you, I took on fights there other people wouldn't take on. That's sort of like the moth to a flame thing. I like those fights because I always had the view that if you're going to go to the legislature, do the hard stuff because everybody can do the easy stuff. You hear members say, well, I'd love to vote for that, but if I vote for that and they come against me in my district, I won't be here to vote on those other 99 things that were really important. And the reality was anybody could have voted for the 99. Show up and vote on the hard one. And that's something that we don't have enough of in politics today. If I could encourage you guys to do one thing in terms of politics, other than tell you how to vote, which I won't, it would be to help restore risk-taking in politics. You know, this is a country that we love to talk about the entrepreneurial spirit. We revere the entrepreneurial spirit until that person disagrees with us. We want people to take risks unless they're in politics. And the number, I can tell you the number of people who, you know, I would have done but for, or I couldn't have done. You know, or they, on the other hand, you get people who run for re-election saying, I got 99% of my bill signed. I think you got 99% of your bill signed, you're not doing anything hard. Because, you know, nobody gets 99% unless they're on Mother's Day resolutions. And you need to encourage people. And, you know, we sort of invented single issue politics in California, which wasn't necessarily a good thing. You know, you have litmus test voting, and if you didn't pass my, don't pass my litmus test, even though you're right on everything else, I'm not gonna vote for you. You know, that's not the way to get people to be creative, take risks, and do the stuff you want to do. Elected officials need to know that it's okay to disagree, and you have to be okay with disagreeing as long as overall, if you disagree with them all the time on everything, that's a different story. But people ought to be allowed to try things and do things and advance ideas without fear of political retribution, or we're just going to have the same old simple stuff. You know, they'll do the stuff that's, you know, they'll do the white bread, they'll do the stuff that's safe, they'll do the stuff that doesn't raise any hackles or doesn't piss anybody off. And if that's what you like, then your country could be happy selling just for being sort of modern.
Richard, the not embracing risk-taking isn't just something that politicians avoid. We recently had a couple of meetings with the National Science Foundation. They are unable to fund high-risk research anymore. And what they say is that the peer review process doesn't allow them to, because they really are bound to a large extent by what the peer reviews are. And if the peer reviewers are not prepared to give a good review for something that's high risk. So we as a nation, we really suffer from not having mechanisms for high-risk ventures. And incremental approaches don't solve these big problems.
Part of why we went forward with the mayor on this idea of building 15 mass transit projects, and 12 mass transit projects in 10 plus years, was the notion that in LA County, if you do one project every 5 years, you're never going to catch up. Right now, there are 75 projects in various stages of either design or construction, all relative to Measure R, which passed in 2008. And you see them on the roads, and you bemoan the congestion that it causes, but it will get better. But we're actually doing stuff because we're willing to. And we went out in 2008, the voters in LA County agreed to an additional sales tax in the middle of the worst recession because they knew it had to be done. And they had faith that the stuff would be built, and we are well on our way to meeting all those commitments. But returning that to it as a way of doing business is hard to do. You know, part of it goes back to, you can go all the way back to, you know, Prop 13 and all that kind of stuff, but for 30 years now, you've had a lot of Democrats and Republicans who run against government to get elected. And then they wonder why people don't want to pay more in taxes. Well, if you spend 30 years telling people something can't do anything, whether it can or not, no one's going to voluntarily give you more money. You know, it just doesn't work that way. And so that's why I go back, in the beginning I said something about short-term, small, quick victories. Part of any policy arena is being able to create some momentum behind what you're doing. And small victories help do that, particularly because bigger projects take longer, cost more, or harder to do. So you need to sort of build up some steam as you're getting towards bigger projects. So I'm a big advocate. Now, transportation, we do signalization, timing signal intersections, or left-hand turn lanes, and a variety of things as we're building these bigger projects. And get some things done. We do Carmageddon, like we do it every day now. We've done it twice, and most people think those are the greatest weekends they ever had in Los Angeles. I mean, after the first Carmageddon, I got letters. People said, "Can you do one a month? Because I had a great time. I met my neighbors, you know, all that kind of stuff." People, it's funny, but it was like, you have to give people in LA permission not to go on the freeway. And then they don't, and they have a great time. But the fact you can do big things like that and pull it off is part of restoring people's faith that government can do things, which is not to say government doesn't need a big overhaul, because it does. But we can get things done, and I think we can make progress in this area. We need to identify some policies or some projects that we can start building momentum around that are marine related, and start building the constituency around those projects. You know, and you look for projects that are near population centers. I mean, it'd be nice to do something on the North Coast, but nobody votes on the North Coast, right? They vote in Eureka and they vote in Orquita, those who remember what election day is. But that's a different culture up there. We're big on absentee ballots in that part of the country because we want them to have a lot of time to think about it and remember to vote. But you look at population centers. You got the Bay Area, you got Southern California, Monterey, Los Angeles, and Long Beach, and then San Diego and the Orange Coast. That's where your voting populations are. Do things that are visible in those areas, have successes in those areas that begin to build the constituency. It's really interesting when we pass park bonds or water bonds in California. To get them out of the legislature, which require 2/3 votes, you need to include all sorts of stuff from the Central Valley that we don't like in the urban areas, things like dams and and storage. And so as a result, to get the 2/3 vote in the legislature, you have to put those things into the package. When the package goes to the voters, the coast is who votes for all that stuff, not the Central Valley. So you have a constituency to get the bill out of the legislature, get it on the ballot. You have a totally different constituency when it comes time to the election. And that's because that's California. Water always was a north-south issue. It's becoming more an east-west issue in California. How we prepare for the fact that maybe we'll have a canal, maybe we won't have a canal in the Bay Area, but one thing that I wouldn't bet long-term against is a natural disaster that occurs somewhere around the bay. It could be a tsunami, it could be a heavy storm, it could be windstorms. Remember, the islands in New Orleans are 8 feet below sea level. I'm sorry, 8 feet below sea level. The islands in the Delta are 20 feet below sea level. So that kind of a surge coming through the Delta. The Delta is this, ecosystem, what's left at this point of an ecosystem of marsh and islands and wetlands, and just all sorts of, and some islands that are farmed, and it's where the Sacramento River and the American River all come into the Delta and the water that comes out, the San Joaquin River. So you got San Joaquin bringing in ag-contaminated water. You've got coming from Shasta pristine water, all meeting in this thing called the Delta, which we depend on in Southern California for the vast majority of our water. It's only a matter of time if they don't start fixing soon the situation before one or several of those islands collapse. Once they collapse, saltwater intrusion that results from the levees collapsing will render that whole area, from a drinking water standpoint, unusable for probably a decade. So if we have not, in the meantime, done a better job of conserving water here, alternatives, and also storing water locally, we are going to have a real hard time, as will our economy, should that happen in the Delta. It's all interconnected, and in ways that people tend not to think about. But what happens in the Delta is very important to what happens down here. We are trying very hard to become more self-sufficient from a water standpoint for that exact reason, because you don't know how long it will take before you have it fixed in place. But not only, by the way, is there water in that, you wouldn't believe the number of gas pipelines, oil pipelines, electrical, fiber optics that come through the Delta. It literally, you want to cut the state in half. You take out the Delta, it's not a geographic half, but you will isolate everything south of Los Banos for a decade if you lose the Delta. So we need to be thinking about these things when making policy decisions, and when the legislature looks at, or local government looks at growth patterns or development. Why is local government allowing building on levees that they're not forced to insure, but they want to build on them anyhow because they're developers who want to make money and they like the levees, it's got a lot of water around it and all that, but they're not willing to also insure those same properties against damage. We tried a bill a while ago that said, look, if local government wants to make those land use decisions, that's fine, but then they're responsible for what happens afterwards. They made the decision, they live with it. Weren't successful in getting that through the legislature. That happened after I lived there. They tried to do that. There are things like that that need to be done. You just need a greater, consensus, if you will, or a greater ability to impact on this. Because you talk to people down here about levees and Delta, and unless you're in this room because you're interested in these issues, most people don't know what you're talking about. It's a real toss-up to see which more people know about. The subway in LA, which I think half of LA does not know about at least, or the Delta. You know, in Southern California, we're dependent on that, and very few people know what that's about. When I first got elected, I think it was my first one, it was the Purple Canal election. Assemblyman Pat Johnston, who was a buddy of mine, represented Stockton, which is the middle of the Delta, Old Delta issue. He and I switched districts for 3 days. I'd read something about some members of Congress doing this. He came down and did my schedule for 3 days, and I went up there and did his schedule for 3 days. He represents Stockton, I represent the San Fernando Valley. We took him up in a traffic helicopter one morning about rush hour, and he saw more cars than he'd ever seen in his life. They took me up in a helicopter, opened the door, and showed me the Delta, and said, "This is where the Purple Canal will go. What's your position?" They opened the door before they asked what. Do you want to rethink that before we? You know, at that time, I don't think, I think I could have walked across the San Fernando Valley and on one hand counted the number of people that knew what a Purple Canal was or cared at that point. Yet it's basic in Northern California. They were smarter than us. They were at least smart enough that after they destroyed Hetch Hetchy, so that San Francisco could be self-righteous about water, they left Yosemite Valley alone, so there's still all that pristine part that we all love so much. But anytime someone from San Francisco wants to lecture you about water used in Southern California, remind them that there were that Hetch Hetchy was supposedly grander than Yosemite. And that's the one they dammed up, so they shouldn't be so self-righteous about our swimming pools. It won't stop them, but they should. I'm sort of talking a lot about policies, and I don't know what can I answer for you guys in terms of how we get this done, or what are your interests in terms of taking what you're talking about here in terms of marine sanctuaries and marine life? What do you think what do you think we should be doing that we're not, or what do you?
Well, I want to come back. So public education, we think, is key. That's why we're so involved in all of these issues. That's why we have a watershed exhibit out there and it also talks about where we get our water. Asking the right questions, framing the issues is something most organizations give you one alternative. That's not what policymakers need. They need a range of alternatives. Right. And one of the things that we have advocated is to create an offshore ocean enterprise zone in Southern California. It would probably be in part state waters and in part federal waters. It would be less than 2% of the total area. The state and the feds would take responsibility for having the permits in place. So then if you had an appropriate industry that was listed on the agenda, aquaculture, offshore wind, you would have to post a bond, but you could rent, say, 100 acres for an aquaculture venture. You set the environmental bar high, and if you fail to meet it, you throw them out, you keep the bond, and we think that this is a way that California could create good jobs, and we are basically, as a state, we have the largest ocean economy of any state in the nation. It is dominated by recreation and tourism, and the average wage that the people who work in these industries, they can't live near the coast, and now they can no longer afford to pay for the gas that it takes to drive 30 miles inland to change the sheets in the hotels or wait on table. It's a terrible situation, and in less than 2%, you don't have to sacrifice any environmental quality, and we think that there's a wonderful opportunity. It's an experiment.
But let me tell you off the top of my head just without the education and the build up to it.
Yep, I know.
Camel's nose under the tent.
Right, exactly.
What was that?
Camel's nose under the tent works better in the desert than it does in the ocean because the camel's going to drown. But the notion that this is the first piercing of that sanctity of the coastline, and that yes, you're doing it for all the right reasons, you're doing it with all the right care, you're doing all the right things right, but once you start with one use, how you control it, and so you'll find people who should be on our side on an issue like that will go back and say no, nothing, because we don't know what it'll be in the future. Seriously, what kind of jobs can you get in the ocean? I mean, all that's the education process that has to take place. And why is this area okay? Then there'll be the other question, which is whatever marine area you choose, the people closest to it won't appreciate it. And will be won't appreciate it is a nice way of putting it, right? Because they'll go, why are you doing it here? If it's such a great idea, do it over there. all of the, you gotta come to my meetings and talk about subway in Beverly Hills. We have a school in Beverly Hills. We have Beverly Hills is objecting to the subway, the extension of the subway to UCLA from their terminates now on Western. And they don't think it's safe to tunnel it under the school. Keep in mind, they have an oil well on
I was
it.
gonna say that,
You know, and there's 150 pipes slant drilling under the school. And just a rough guess, I think if both of those things blow up, the oil well or my tunnel, oil well's gonna make a much bigger hole than my tunnel is. And, you know, it's that kind of crazy stuff. So fear is a powerful motivator when combined with, especially when combined with a lack of facts or a lack of truth. And so part of what I would go back to Jerry's, one of the things I think in putting stuff like this together, and I learned a lot trying to do recycled water when I was on the state water board, you know, toilet to tap, all that stuff. Folks in San Diego graduated from toilet to tap. They got more understanding and came up with showers to flowers. Not bad, you know, it's a little pushback on toilet to tap, but what's really critical is transparency when putting it together and spending more time. I know everybody hates to spend a lot more time on the front end with community groups and neighborhood organizations and the various environmental groups, wherever it may be. But what I find is if you spend more time on the front end, that at the end of the day, some people still may not agree with you, but they're not going to knock you on having a bad process. And while that sounds like bureaucratic speak, in terms of CEQA, in terms of a lot of things, process is what matters. But it's also what matters in terms of people being comfortable with what you're doing and getting them in on the front end, letting them make suggestions, showing them, explaining, letting people have comments on it. You know, all that kind of stuff helps. One, it helps flesh out the project, frankly, in some ways, but it also helps build. It helps build support by the people who are vested in the process now because they spent the time and they care. And it also identifies opposition. So, you know, the project like you're talking about, you know, how you choose the area, who does it, all those kinds of things is something I think you need to get maximum transparency on. And even if it means spending more time and more money on the front end than anybody wants to, because nobody really enjoys those meetings. But you have to do, it's part of the deal. You know, it goes with the chance to do something good, also comes with a lot of meetings you don't want to go to. But it's part of it, you know, it's part of what you do.
I'd like to hear questions or comments from others.
Yes,
It's easy to see that we, as Californians, based on the title of the overarching theme of leader of laggards, that we're laggards in many areas of policy making that, you know, we could all establish. But which ones are we leaders in? California.
I could go with medical marijuana, but I don't think that's what we want to go with. No, we're the California, well, no, I think in transportation, we're among the leaders in the country in terms of the innovative transportation we're doing, certainly in Los Angeles and transit-oriented development. California historically, and that's an important departure point at this point, but historically it's been, you know, the university system, it's been the sciences, the arts, high tech, etc. More recently, unfortunately, it's become, you know, Prop 13s and some of the more restrictive ways of doing business. And I think that we're at a time where we got to decide, you know, I chair the Metrolink board, where my board's having this interesting conversation. We will be the first railroad in America, passenger railroad in America next year to implement positive train control, which is probably the greatest advancement in railroad safety that will take place in our lifetime. Positive train control is essentially a GPS-based system, satellite system that has the ability to slow a train. It's part of a redundancy in systems, you know. Human failure, computer backup, human correction. But positive train control will not only slow your train if a signal is missed or the engineer doesn't react properly or it's going too fast, but when doing so, it takes into account wind speed, grade, weight of the train, what's going on there. I mean, it's a complete look at how you slow trains down. And the Chatsworth accident, which killed 25 people in 2008, the Metrolink issue, I got on board after that. I got on board because the mayor spent 24 hours out there at the site helping bodies off the train and called on a Saturday and said, you just got to fix this. And I've known him 20 years, and he spent 20 hours out there. You know, the tone in his voice was different. It was just a different conversation. By next July, Metrolink will be the safest railroad in America. We went from 25 to being the safest railroad in America. We have put in place crash energy management cars, which diffuse energy around the car, so you don't split trains anymore. We put inward and outward facing cameras over the objection of some of the union members who thought it was an invasion of privacy, and we said, respect your privacy, but your privacy ends where everyone else's right to live starts. And so we're creating positive train control. We will be the first in the country to do it. Yes, sir.
Well, we all know that cataclysmic legislation works because it's quick and it's dramatic.
It doesn't work for long.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you strike while hot. But, you know, you have a big emergency and you respond to it. But we're involved in an ocean system that is slowly collapsing. You know, the Great Barrier Reef, when your kid is my age, won't be there. But that's a slow progress. It's not a train crash, it's not an airplane.
Which also means it's not leading the news and informing people that
it's not bleeding.
It's not bleeding, exactly. If it bleeds, it leads.
And so it comes down to an educational program. And Jerry had a speaker here a couple of years ago who was, he was actually a geologist, but he was working with a number of other scientists in various disciplines. And it wasn't about science, it was about packaging information to get to legislators, because they're picking up the phone to go to a fundraising golf tournament, and they've got a prayer breakfast, and they've got this and that. When do they study the subjects? Well, in bits and pieces. It was kind of an interesting talk, and I guess the program died or something, but they were trying to put together sound bites for politicians, if you will,
Sure.
where you could get their attention.
People ask me,
And it gets harder and harder because the funding that they need to stay in office, which is the primary goal of a politician, is more and more
I
demanding
disagree
of
with
their
you on
time.
that one, but we'll get
Well,
back to that.
most politicians.
But you know,
But you're a Democrat, so.
we clearly are leaders in marine protected areas. We're going to hear about that in the next hour. We clearly are the leader in terms of setting the percentage of energy that has to be generated from renewables. We clearly are a leader in AB 32. So I think we have a lot of visionary policies to protect our environment. But protect is equivalent to prohibit in what you said earlier.
Well, and also to protect also sort of implies status quo, because you're protecting what you have. And I think status quo for the ocean is not good enough.
No.
Status quo for, air quality. Think about this, I don't know, how many of you were born in Southern California or like? The numbers are picking up from when I used to start doing this. I used to do that, and I said, the reason I do that is for us natives to know who's causing all the congestion on the road. Because it helps make the point that we're all part of the problem. Status quo is not good enough, because status quo, as you were saying, means over time we will lose. The problem is you don't have a bright picture to put on the evening news of, coral reefs collapsing, and, occasionally you'll have the whale washed up on the beach or something. But dramatizing it's hard for folks. And because the oceans are not something they think about, it's not like you see smokestacks when you drive down the freeway, so you think about it. Oceans are much harder. And so I think what it means, though, is, again, finding some smaller projects to get some victories that you can build on, getting press around those, and getting exposure around those. The other thing I would say, though, that I would encourage you, this was always a fight I used to have, I had in the beginning with my staff, but not that long. Staff tends to want to present feasible options. So they tend to cut off the extremes because it's crazy, or you don't want to do it, or it's too hard. And I said, no, I want to see the extremes. For one reason, there tend to be a lot more fun than the stuff in the middle. And second, as I said earlier, I'm a big believer that if you can do this stuff, do the big stuff, and do the hard stuff. But the other reason is, I see a different field than they see. So from their standpoint, staff may say, well, you're never going to get this passed because so-and-so has an objection to it. But what they don't know is that another committee I sit on, I'm working with that same person on something else, and therefore I might be able to get it passed because we've developed a relationship around something else. Don't cut off the extremes when you're looking at your options, because there's some cool stuff on the edges.
And status quo is not good enough. And often what we do is, when we're not happy, we raise the standards. We've done it in education. That's not the solution to the problem. You just have a larger percentage of kids fail. You have to reframe the issues. You can't accommodate, whether it's 37 or 8 million in California or 7.2 billion, by continuing to somehow separate people from nature. You can't do it. You have to reframe the issue and figure out ways, how can we live in greater harmony with nature?
And you're exactly right, because there is a tendency in this country and in this state to want to kill things we can't control. You know, and I wrote the original legislation that became the mountain lion initiative in 1990 that banned the sport hunting of mountain lions in California. And I'll never forget, I had a great meeting with the hunters. Like, I first got elected, I'm 30 years old, I'm cool, I'm on top of it, I know what I'm doing. And they came in, they said they wanted to talk to me about sport hunting and mountain lions. I said, sure, come on in. And wow, an urban guy said yes. I said, let me just stop you guys, because I think there's a way to work this out. We can all get what we want out of this. I could support sport hunting and mountain lions as long as, you know, you can't use dogs, you can't use the mechanized bow and arrow, but you either use a bow and arrow or a knife. Let's at least even it out a little bit here, and then, you know, then I'll support sport hunting and mountain lions. They didn't think that was very sporting. I thought it was totally sporting. I don't think there's anything sporting about letting loose a bunch of dogs to go tree a mountain lion. So some guy who's been drinking beer for 5 hours can walk over to the site and shoot the mountain lion out of a tree. First of all, it's wrong, just wrong. It's not even very sporting. You know, so, you know, I mean,
So part of it, then we have to move on.
Okay.
We live in an amazing state with the greatest diversity of environments of any state in the nation. The greatest diversity of climates of any state in the nation. A great public university system that's being starved, a great state university system, two of them, both the UC and they're private. We have 3 national labs. Most states would kill to have one. And we've still got 50% of the venture capital in the entire United States. And we're stuck in the mud, we're broke. Something's wrong.
we don't have folks, you know, it goes back to not having folks willing to take risks and willing to do the hard stuff.
Yes. To reframe it and try something.
Yeah, but the reframe is an important part of it too.
Richard, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, now for the next roughly hour, we're going to talk about something where California very clearly is a leader. And the 3 gentlemen up to my left all have played leadership roles in the Marine Life Protection Act, and mostly, I guess, in the South Coast, although, Steve, you've been in more than just this region, I guess, right? But, so, I want to introduce them to you. I know that we have some people here who know a great deal about marine protected areas and the Marine Life Protection Act, but not everybody does, so we're going to start by trying to define what it means. So with Bob Bertelli, Bob is a commercial fisherman. He's been a commercial fisherman since 1975. He's been a scuba diving instructor, dive shop operator. He has a BA in history from Fresno State and a number of certifications for water safety and so on. But his fishing background is primarily in dive fisheries, sea urchin, sea cucumber, in abalone. He's a trustee of the California Fisheries Coalition, which represents a diverse group of fishing and ocean-dependent interests. He was elected to the California Sea Urchin Commission, served as chair from 2008 to 2010, and was reelected for the 2012-2014 term. He was a member of the South Coast Regional Stakeholders Group for the Marine Life Protection Act Initiative. He's very articulate fisherman, but knowledgeable about all the large issues. Next to him is Paul Hamdorf. Paul is an employee of the California Department of Fish and Game. He's the acting Marine Region Manager for the entire California coast on special assignment from the Southern Enforcement District. He's a lifetime resident of Southern California, started his career working as a state lifeguard in Orange County, and in 1992 he was hired as game warden and was assigned to a patrol boat covering the Channel Islands and the local coast. Throughout his career he has worked on ocean issues including pollution, fisheries enforcement, market inspections, wildlife issues. And our third panelist is Steve Wirtz. Steve joined the California Department of Fish Game in 1993. He's the acting Marine Region Habitat Conservation Program Manager. Prior to his tenure as senior marine biologist, he had extensive experience conducting fishery independent and fishery dependent investigations of California's nearshore fisheries to inform resource management and conservation decisions. He also co-chaired the Pacific Fishery Management Council's highly migratory species management team and represented the department on the Director's Marine Life Protection Act Science Advisory team. He received a bachelor's from Cal State Long Beach. So we have three very knowledgeable people who are very involved in the Marine Life Protection Act process. And we're going to be focusing on the South Coast. That's a map that shows these 50 marine protected areas of different kinds in the Southern California Bight. And some think we have too few, some think we have too many, some think they're too large, some think they're too small. But I want to start by giving a very quick overview of the purpose of the Marine Life Protection Act. What was different with that? Because we had marine protected areas long before the Marine Life Protection Act. Steve, why don't you start?
Okay, the Marine Life Protection Act was implemented because over many decades, little protected areas, postage stamp size areas were put aside for protection. For single species, there was no management plan defined, there was no connectivity between them. And so after many decades, legislature decided we need to redefine the network, make some connectivity there, have a management plan that will guide the production of these marine protected areas and management of them. And it followed what was called the Marine Life Management Act, which was cornerstone of fisheries management. We brought us in the 21st century. And the legislature realized that we did not have protections for marine biodiversity, conservation, and habitat protection. It can enhance fisheries, but it's mostly about habitat protection. And so in '99, it was passed. The state didn't have the ability to implement such a grand act. So in 2004, we formed the Marine Life Protection Act Initiative. It was a public-private partnership. It was an MOU signed. It was one of the largest, as far as I know, the department's been involved in a marine region public participation exercises. Very transparent. We have a lot of, I guess we'll talk more about it, but it resulted in establishing 124 marine protected areas along the California coastline. It's about 16% of the coastline. Prior to that process, less than 3% of the coastline was in some type of protected area.
And different levels of restrictions in terms of what's allowed and what's not.
There's 3 designations. There's a state marine reserve. It's the same concept as like going to Yosemite. You can't take anything from the area of living or non-living. But like the previous speaker spoke, you can surf there, dive there, motorboat through there, scuba. You can do everything you want, just no take. The second level of protection is called a marine conservation area that allows limited commercial and recreational fishing in that conservation area. And then the third is a state park, which primarily just only allows limited amounts of recreational activities. There's actually only one in the state right now. And we have a couple of what we call special closures. They weren't regularly marine protected areas, but our Fish and Game Commission uses those to establish protection for seabird nesting sites and rookeries and marine mammal haulouts.
Okay, now we heard our previous speaker say that when you do these kinds of processes, you've got the transparency, you have to spend a lot of time, they're very inefficient, but the argument that he made, and one I agree with, is that if you're going to be effective downstream, you have to tolerate these huge inefficiencies and frictional losses upstream. Bob, you were involved in this. Was this a transparent process?
It was reasonably transparent. It depends on your perception of what transparency is supposed to be. As Richard was pointing out earlier, it's important to have transparency, but we live in a time where the other side wants you to be transparent, but they don't really want to be transparent. And so that's, but I think overall it was reasonably transparent. And the one area where we felt that there wasn't a lot of transparency was right at the top. And that was what was called the Blue Ribbon Task Force. And the Blue Ribbon Task Force supposedly had a legal opinion that they were not covered by Bagley-Keene, the Open Meeting Act. And so they felt that they could meet in private, bring in consultants and talk about the issues, and that didn't have to be part of the public process. Now, some of us kept objecting to that, and at one point, I said, I'd like to see this legal opinion, because my legal opinion is that you are covered by Bagley-Keene. And they looked at me and I said, I guarantee you, this is going to go to court someday, and the court's going to rule against you. And the court ruled against you. So that part I had a little bit of problem with. I think a lot of people had a little bit of problem with that. Because some people had better access to people on the Blue Ribbon Task Force than others. But overall, I was not unhappy with the process.
Okay. And you represent the fishermen, and as a community, they were the ones who felt you were giving up maybe more than other groups. Is that a fair statement?
I think that most of the fishermen were very, very apprehensive about this whole process and are still apprehensive about it.
Paul, add your perspective to the process and your role. Then I want to look at this map and want somebody to explain, if you can, how did we end up with these particular areas?
I'll let Steve talk about how we ended up. But my role, like you said, I came from the enforcement. So January 1st, we got this series of closures. And really, if you look, there's no road signs out in the ocean, markers to say, hey, this is the, and that we've got, a huge population in this area. And some were paying attention to the process, and others might not pay attention until that one weekend a year that they go to the beach. And then, they traditionally go fishing or whatever they do that may now be illegal. So for us, we started out kind of behind the eight ball, not really knowing that the whole process was new for Fish and Game, this collaboration. There's a lot of people think that Fish and Game drove the whole thing, and this is all our MPAs. Well, really, they're California's MPAs. We have, as a department, a lot of responsibilities. But we couldn't do it ourselves. We couldn't have got them to this point by ourselves, and we can't enforce it by ourselves. So as enforcement, we've learned a lot here. We'll move forward, to the North Coast, but just starting out really with not even any handouts. We didn't know when the law was going to get passed. We had a short period of time. Things kind of moved slow in state government. Now, 6 months into it, we have books to hand out, and we've got online stuff, but we're really in education. We picked up the role. We educated a lot before education through citation or education through arrest, where people, when they knew what they were doing was wrong.
Have you had to arrest Bob yet?
No. No, and I'm probably in my first days of work, I check Bob, so it's funny how our lives have crossed a lot. But what it has done, we've noticed that there's all kinds of groups that come together on this, and that you would think maybe you could even have some of the same people in the same room. And I'm sure there's people that would be surprised, say there's a game warden and a commercial fisherman sitting down to dinner, but we're not always that far apart. So I would say from the enforcement standpoint, now I've moved over to the Marine region, so my job is kind of progressing through this. The education is the biggest deal.
And will continue to be very important. So Bob, but I want, if you look at that map, before the MLPA, we have had a bunch of marine protected areas. What was the goal? Was it to identify critical areas not to exceed a certain percentage, or was it to restore fish stocks? What was the goal that drove the selection of this. Is that, do we want to address that, or do you want a different?
Well, one of the things I want to just build on what Paul was saying, because it's very true, is that the one, to me, the huge positive that came out of the process was you've got a lot of people together that never would have known each other. So I have friends that are with Heal the Bay. I have science friends now that I wouldn't have had. My science IQ's gone up quite a bit because of this, but a lot of fishermen were forced to learn about the science in order to deal with the process. So we have a better understanding of that, and I think a lot of people in the environmental community and the science community have a much better idea of what we do and why we do it. And when you go back and forth and actually talk to one another, it's amazing how much common ground you can find. And if you don't talk to one another, you're not going to find any common ground, and then we don't get anything done.
So
Now,
when you're looking at that map, what was the goal to start with? Did you know when you were done?
Well, from a fishing standpoint, we knew that we were going to have to give up some very valuable fishing area. So our viewpoint was try to meet the science guidelines of the process, which they kept changing on us all the time. No, literally, when we go to a meeting, we would come up with a set of arrays, and then based on the science that we had from the previous meeting, and then they would come up with some new science. So I think most of the scientists that I talked to, and I think maybe Steve would agree with this, but I'm not going to put words in his mouth, is it would have been a lot better if the science would have been in place that we were going to use before we started, and then move forward. But that was our idea, is okay, what is going to have the least effect on the fishing industry? And by fishing industry, I'm speaking of not just commercial fishing, but sport fishing also. Sport fishing is, while the individual sport fishermen are not supposed to be selling their catch and making money off of it, it's not even supposed to be a subsistence fishery, where they constantly feed their families, which there is some of that. But it's still a very, very valuable industry to this state. All the fishing tackle sales, the fuel sales, the boat sales, people going down to the beach. So that was the idea. And then we tried to give it some thought also, so where are they actually going to do not just the most harm, but the most good? So this is where you get into this idea of larval connectivity. So you have some areas that produce a lot of larvae, and that larva gets transported to other areas that maybe don't produce that much. So that was one of the big hard things that we had to deal with, was where to site these things, where, as Steve was saying, there was a connectivity between the reserves. And that model was based on fairly simple mathematics. It wasn't all that complicated, because the fact of the matter is that we don't know a whole lot about larval transport. We're making guesses. How long does a particular animal live in the larval stage? In the lab, it may be one thing, but out in the wild, we don't know. Because you have a lot of other things going on that you can't duplicate in the lab. I'm talking too much.
Steve, pick up on this though. So,
Well, I was going to take a step back just for a moment. We talked about the Act. One of the things in the Act is that you had to develop a master plan to guide the development of the protected areas using the best available science, and that probably is some part of what Bob was speaking about. And part of the guidelines was you needed to establish the MPAs. We had like a minimum and maximum size or preferred size that would keep all the reef fish within that range. And then we had spacing between the MPAs so that the larvae could import or export from one to the other, plus spill over into the adjacent areas. And one of the other things the Act required in the master plan was key habitats. And that's one of the things Bob was saying, like the good areas. We had to replicate 3 to 5 similar habitats like kelp canopy, nearshore rocky reef, subtidal south bottoms. We had to get 3 to 5 replicates just in the Southern California area to have the same habitats that were protected along the coast and out at the islands. And one of the things we did to try to assist the fishermen was one of the contractors that was part of the process had gone out and interviewed the fishermen about where they fish and what areas were there. They gave them a stack of pennies, 100 pennies. They said, put these pennies where your most valuable habitat is, and you can't give it up. So they took that information and put it into the GIS, Geographic Information System database, and they plotted all the hot spots. And if those hot spots fell on a very productive area, a good area to maybe establish a protected area, but also good fishing grounds, they tried to look for areas that were similar but wouldn't have the economic impact. And that was very difficult to do. And I watched the regional stakeholders. There was 64 of them representing all sorts of interests, wastewater treatment plants, beach nourishment activities, government agencies, commercial, recreational fishermen. Even within those groups, you've got spear fishermen who think different than hook and line anglermen. You've got lobster fishermen who think different than hook. And they all had to make these decisions, and they all had their own turf, and it was pretty tough. But I just wanted to add on to this was, since this process has happened, California has, of all the contiguous states, the biggest network of marine protected areas. Oregon is constantly asking us about our system. We have government officials coming down from Canada, BC, Italy, England, Australia, all contacting us about the public process. And we didn't do perfect, but it was a pretty transparent, in such a large activity to be completed.
So there are five regions, and in previous discussions that we've had, I think you all agreed that the two most difficult are the South Coast and San Francisco Bay. Paul, say a word. Why is this more challenging than say the Mid-Coast was?
The earlier speaker talked about kind of the not in my backyard. So if it's going to hurt business there, that sounds like great, but let's protect it where I can keep my local businesses. Or some communities believe that they wanted the closures, and it's come down to, we kind of joke about it, that if everybody's angry, then as a fishing game, we're probably doing a pretty good job, because we're not out to serve any one interest, and really our overarching goal is to, preserve the resource, make it available for use, whether it's just enjoyment of the resource or whether it's take of some of the resource. But you're never going to make, if we walked away and somebody was really happy, one group obviously, then and I think nobody walked away. There's people who thought there should be a lot more closures. There's other people who think there should be no closures. But just the sheer number of people here, all with differing opinions. And I would have never thought, I got a call as a head law enforcement person for Southern California. They said the bar at the hotel that they're holding this meeting at is out of liquor. Mm-hmm. And Long Beach PD just went on tactical alert. What are we going to do? But there were so many people showed up, for the ocean issue. So I think it's just a number of people, and then they would at times focus on their individual issues, so it's full of passion. And the amount of pressure they can, a small group, motivated group can put on politicians is amazing. Sometimes we laugh at how many, like what a small group can make a big department do if they're motivated and tactical. So I think Southern California, that's just so many people, so much use of the ocean that no matter what we came up with, there was going to be people irritated.
This is an example of one element of coastal and marine spatial planning. And it's a clear acknowledgement that the ocean is very heterogeneous in terms of where marine life is most abundant, where the spawning and nursery areas are. It's also, the ocean is also very heterogeneous in terms of where the mineral resources are. And so part of the rationale behind all of this is to acknowledge that heterogeneity and separate the different uses to protect coastal and ocean ecosystems. Bob?
We had a speaker here a little while ago, Dean from
Dean.
San Luis Obispo.
Dean.
And he was very complimentary to the fishermen he dealt with, because, it's an exchange of educational viewpoints, hands-on versus a scientist and such. But from a hands-on perspective, Bob, is it been time to see a change either yay or nay in this program? If fisheries recovered, is it affected you positively or negatively?
Or is it too early to tell?
Or is it too early to tell? Yeah.
Well, first of all, it's too early to tell.
Okay.
Second of all, there's an assumption that our fisheries are in real trouble. Most of our fisheries are actually in pretty good shape because the department's been managing our fisheries very well for a long time, way before the Marine Life Protection Act. As most of us know, for good or bad, California is usually out on the front edge of things just because that's our nature. Whether most people know it or not, this has always been a progressive state, politically and everything else. So, but it's, oh, and by the way, it was the environmental NGOs that were sucking up all that alcohol. Fishermen could hardly get a drink. So there are going to be some fisheries that are probably going to see some real benefit from this. There's some fisheries that are probably not going to see any benefit from this, but the real answer is, right now, we don't have an answer.
Yeah.
We can speculate, and, you know, Steve maybe has a better idea of some fisheries that might benefit more than others. Certainly, I would think some of the reef finfish are probably going to benefit well from MPA.
At least you're putting some benchmarks in place that you can measure off of. I mean, you've got some areas now that you can do repetitive checks on and see if there are any changes.
Say a word about the monitoring to respond to that.
Yeah, for each of the regions, you know, there's 5 we talked about, 4 coastal ones. After each region was implemented, there was $4 million from the Ocean Protection Council that was funneled down for monitoring for each of them. So we've done 1 year of monitoring in Southern California. We're doing a 2nd year, and that is to measure the benchmark. Now that these things are in place, inventory them, see what's there, catalog them, and then we'll have to come back in 5 years and some other series of time to measure if there has been change. And if there is, it's something called adaptive management. You know, the MPA could maybe potentially become larger or smaller, or more activities might be allowed in an MPA because we know new information that was collected. But it's going to take, I mean, seriously, in 5 years, there'll be some fisheries you might see some change, but it's way out on the horizon.
It's going to start somewhere.
The Mid-Coast is just getting ready to have their 5-year review, right?
Yeah, the Central Coast is coming up on their 5 review next year. It's going to be in Monterey, February 27th through the March 1st. And we'll have all the baseline study information presented. And we'll have some researchers that were independent of that baseline data collection give their presentations. And there'll be a 3rd day will be something on governance.
Bruce?
I wanted to point out that the original postage stamp scattering of small and unstandardized protections was changed in this act to make it permanent. Much like the education system is composed of different kinds of institutions for different grade levels of students, and just as that educates every generation, the idea of the marine life protection with its 5-year modifications is a permanent protection, which will alter under scientific reasons, and with different stakeholders agreeing on consensus that this one will disappear and that one will split and a new one will be created. But it's not it looks like a permanent map, but it's not.
It's not, although adaptive management is often a hard thing to do. You want to say a word about why adaptive management is so hard to do? Anybody? It's hard to admit that the map wasn't perfect in the beginning, number one. Secondly, if I'm a wealthy homeowner along the coast, and if there's a marine protected area out in front of my house, and now 5 years later you're going to say that hasn't really done much good, we're going to take it away. You've seen some of those pressures, right?
Yeah, we have, and I don't think that type of pressure, though, could really result in changing the boundaries of a protected area.
Or could it result in the undesignation of an area?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't, I mean,
Nobody's listening, you can tell us.
Yes, I don't think that could happen. I think it's gonna take a long time. Before some of these MPAs were even in place, some of our fishermen that were proactive wanted to already create some studies to, like for the urchin fishery and kelp, interaction there. And we first had to get them established and get the baseline set up. So there's people eager to see adaptive management, but that means something different to everybody in the room. And I think that's personally, I think it's in a long time coming. One thing I did want to say a moment ago that I forgot to mention when we were talking about the different designations is the red areas are the reserves, and they're considered the backbone for the network. And we did try to get the reserves in very strategic, best type of habitats available on the coastline. And around the Channel Islands, the northern Channel Islands up there, that was established in a wholly, solely separate process than the Marine Life Protection Act. And that's where a lot of the reserves came from. I think it was 11 with a couple of small conservation areas. And then the rest along the coastline were from the planning process itself.
So process is important and partnerships. Say a word about how partnerships, you mentioned that in the interview we did with you for the film, you can't enforce without the partnerships. So talk about public-private.
Traditionally, if you figured at best we're going to have 300 game wardens for the entire state, that's not for the coast and the islands and stuff. You start spreading that over that map, it's not nearly enough to do anything. We've always relied on our constituents and consumptive users to help with enforcement. I mean, it's really a lot, it's kind of like community policing on the ocean. Our commercial fleets, because most people want to do the right thing, will have a way of letting us know who's out of line. The sport fleets as well, and even some of the people we thought we might have issues with the sport boat fleet, the party boats. And they've turned out to be some of the best sources of information for us on compliance, because they know exactly where the line is, and they'll call and say, there's a bunch of people violating, and they also don't want to, they know that in this day and age, they can't afford to get a black eye for intentionally violating. So they're being a big help with us. And that's kind of spilled over to other things where a lot of our fisheries are managed not just by the state, but we have to comply with federal regulations as well. And so we've taken our sport boat fleet partners with us to the federal meetings and said, okay, there's 3 options. And if you were us, what would you do? What would hurt you the least? We could pick one of the 3. And in the past, we would have just picked what we thought was best. Now we're involving them in the process, and they go, well, we understand, it's like shooting my right foot or shoot my left foot, or maybe something in between. But that level of trust, and then we can help out. And I think the MPAs kind of pushed a lot of that forward. A lot of people talking that weren't talking in the past.
I think it's been a very good process. One thing that I'll come to. You look at that map, there are a lot of driving forces that resulted in this configuration of these areas. What were, in your opinion, what was the most important? Was it science? Was it politics? Or was it stakeholder pressure? You had to pick one, only one. What would be the primary driving force you think that resulted in this final configuration?
Science, 90% of which was political science.
Wait a minute. What's political science?
Well,
I know what poli-sci is, but what in your sense?
Well, let me stand up here just for a second.
Are you running for office or something?
Yeah, they keep asking me that. I spend more time in Sacramento than guys like Richard do. Anyway, as Paul said, I keep showing up everywhere. So there's something that isn't on this map that should be on this map. There, as a result of MPAs, there's a big closed area right here at the west end of San Clemente Island. That is being treated like an MPA by the Navy, but it doesn't show up on any of the maps. We're not allowed in there anymore. Now, you talk about a political situation. What some of you don't realize is that the Navy SEALs have their primary training facility at the west end of San Clemente Island. They have built facilities out there that they can build mock-ups of any U.S. embassy anywhere in the world. They have shooting houses that are better than the ones now that the Special Air Services has in Britain. And now they come over and they're training with some of our guys. So they wanted, for safety's sake, to have that area closed, the Navy did. But they didn't want to call it an MPA because they didn't want to sacrifice any control over that area to the state, is what it came down to. This got dealt with not in the stakeholders in the end. They asked me to intercede. Yeah, okay. I don't think so. I know what's going on, but this got basically settled at the White House. There was that's the politics, because what most people, just looking at this map, just going through the door, and we all recognize this really fast when this whole process started, is that virtually every square inch of the Southern California bite is being utilized by somebody. And it's a very important utilization. And the military is a huge player in that, because this whole entire area, going way out offshore and stuff, is part of a giant military training complex. They've got ships, submarines, missiles, the missiles that come out of Vandenberg. So all this stuff is being done here. And San Clemente Island is really the heartbeat of the whole military complex as far as training in Southern California. So there were some pretty big political issues that came into this thing, and when you really start taking these into consideration, like I told a lot of people, is that we have to understand that national security is a little more important than, if I have to move my operation a couple of miles down the island.
But some of these federal areas like that one, they are among our most environmentally protected areas we have. Chesapeake Bay, Edgewood, Arsenal, Laggard, Improving Ground. But if you look at that whole map, what percentage, how many squares of this size with the military where there's actually protection? How big of an area would it be?
Well, that's full-size MPA. If it was there, if it was on the map, it would meet the criteria of being a very large MPA. But again, they didn't want anything interfering with their training exercises out there. A lot of people wanted to put one down here at the bottom of the island. That's called SHOBA, the shore bombardment. That's where the ships and the airplanes and stuff, and then the SEALs also go down there and shoot up the place occasionally. So it was, and then there was other things that, initially up at Vandenberg in the Central Coast, they had to make some real compromises there, and then there were some more compromises down in San Diego and around Camp Pendleton and stuff for the same reason. So everybody in the end, and the Navy and the Department of Defense was pretty good. They did not, I'll tell you one, the Navy did not want to put this one here, right? They wanted to put one here, which would have devastated several of our fisheries. And we negotiated. This was something that did take place at the local level. And they finally agreed to move it out there to Big Rock.
Cree, you had a question.
I actually have two questions. How valuable has the mobile website been, the one that's using the smartphones? And the other one is that in our particular area, we have something unique. We have state marine conservation areas that are actually reserves. Bolsa Chica is one of them. That was not duplicated in the north, and I wonder why there were none in the north, but we have, I think, 2 or 3 down here.
Who wants to do that?
I'll do the mobile app. The mobile app has, it's funny. There is a certain percentage of people that believe that if they turn that application on, that the Department of Fish and Game will be able to track you. And it's so far out for so many reasons, we can barely, get books printed. And so there's people believing that we could track them, but it is a great thing because a lot of people don't carry, a book with them on a boat or something like that, but they can, and I myself been out of the island and gone, where exactly is that border? And you can look at it, and then we've gotten really positive feedback because the regulations are laid on top of it too. So that's part of that education part, and it's actually more, more cost effective for us to do that because we can just make all the changes in one place once it's up and running than it is to reprint. These regulations are going to change just because nobody thought these were entirely correct, and then even if you thought they were correct, we talked at dinner about the wording. So, and then I just wanted to touch on like monitoring things in the ocean that happen for so many different reasons. There's, for fisheries, you're looking at politics, weather, just all kinds of different things. And so monitoring for a short period of time is going to tell you a little bit, but the real information is going to come, as time goes on, those numbers are going to be more important. Because even if you go on the same day, people are asking, what is compliance like? Well, if it's raining and 40 knot winds, compliance is really high. But when it's warm and everybody's out and they're just breaking out their fishing rods for the beginning of the summer, compliance maybe not so good. So it's going to take time really to see how effective they are in every respect.
Yeah, that's one of the things we talked about earlier when all three of these guys were interviewed for a film we're doing on marine protected areas in the Southern California. Right? And patience and constancy of commitment will be key. Because this is you're doing this for the long term. Yes, you may change some of the geometry and so on, but this is a long-term bet. What about Kareem's other point, though, about the Bolsa Chica and those?
Well, in Southern California, with the demographics and all the infrastructure we have along the coastline, there are areas that were key or essential to have maybe like a reserve, but there would be like a sewage outfall pipe. And you could not call it a reserve because if you went out to maintain the sewer outfall or had to take some type of samples from that particular reserve, that would constitute take. So we call it a state marine conservation area that allowed no take. And if you look at part of the regulations, it'll say except for maintenance of existing artificial man-made structures or for certain other reasons. But that's why we got that designation. As you go farther up the coast, you didn't have to put an MPA where there would be like a pipeline or some type of artificial structure offshore that might need some work. And I was kind of reflecting on the map just a moment ago, and you kind of look at the mainland, you can see those MPAs are spaced out. And California is very limited in Southern California, kelp canopy and shallow rock. And so people spent many hours of trying to figure out, we were requiring the science as the guidelines to capture so much kelp canopy, so much rocky reef, and it's very limited. And so you can see, you got a little bit up there in the Point Conception area, and not too much in Santa Barbara, and then you get to the Point Doom area, and there's a big gap all the way down to Point Vicente, and then you got some of Laguna, and then all the way down to San Diego. And a lot of those places exceeded the spacing guidelines, but it was so tough to try to find the right habitat that you could provide protection for, but also not put somebody out of business.
Steve brought copies of the Guide to Southern California Marine Protected Areas. I think we have enough to give everyone one of these at the end. So let's see. Larry, go ahead.
I think Bob asked the question to Bob earlier, and I didn't hear the answer. You can answer it as you or as most of the fishermen you're aware of. How much of an economic impact has it had so far? Or, is it major, minimal, positive,
Well,
it may not be a simple answer. But
Okay, incorporate part of this, the argument about compressing.
one of the things that happened, and this is So I explained earlier how I thought it would have been better if the science was in place. Well, what myself and a lot of people, including, big proponents of this process, agree on now is that it might have been better to go through this process, design the MPAs, have them in place ready to go, but don't activate them until we make adjustments in fisheries management, because you're taking the same number of fishermen and you're compacting them into a much smaller area. And when it comes to shellfish, most of the shellfish that we harvest, especially sea urchin, lots and stuff, they all congregate around this very rare hard bottom, especially the 30 meters to the beach. And so we were very jealous of giving up very much of that, because even though it turns out to be, oh, and by the way, some fishermen are allowed to go into the blue zones, but shell fishermen don't get to go into any of the zones. Okay, I'm not quite, well, we don't have time for and I think if we had it to do all over again, that would change somewhat. So maybe in a few years it will change. But the economic impact, the sea urchin fishery is already feeling it someplace, especially around the area here in Long Beach and Los Angeles, because a lot of our urchin boats would go to San Clemente Island. And that area out on the west end of San Clemente Island was one of our best areas. So now we're having to dive into other areas that aren't as productive, and sometimes the product wasn't as good, because the sea urchin, you can't tell until you crack it open really how good it is. It's not like, you got a 15 or 20 pound salmon and you look at it, it smells good, you got a nice fish and everybody knows that. Not with sea urchins. The sea urchin has to take the roe, or actually the gonad is what it is, and you take that out and they grate it and pack it, and that's the edible part of the sea urchin. But this whole issue of compaction, right now the lobster fishery, both sport and commercial, the commercial guys, this is their first full year of these MPAs being in place. And so they're scrambling to try to figure out, some of the guys are fishing areas that they've never fished before because their area got so heavily impacted by this. And one of the things that some of the guys did wrong, and I'm not going to single out anyone, but there was one port where when they were going around with those 100 pennies and doing that survey, they lied. And so in the end, they were the ones who got hurt the worst. And those of us who told the truth, people really did go out of their way. And I'm talking about the other side, if there is another side to this, especially when they get to know you. It's really easy to put it to somebody you don't know. Yeah. But when you get to know people, I don't really want to put you out of business, And so, anyway, did I answer your question? I was all over the place.
Well, I mean, is it hurting yet?
Yeah. Yeah. Now, whether we can adapt to it or not, some people will adapt better than others. In other words, there are some guys who don't need to make as much money as others, so maybe they can hunker down. If you have a younger guy who's just starting off, maybe has a family, just bought a house, maybe that might be a little harder on him. But in my fishery, it's kind of interesting because, you see, not in my backyard, the NIMBYism is unequal. Urchin divers are not like regular fishermen. We come from a very diverse background. A lot of guys have, I got a guy that ties his boat up next to me. He's got a PhD in mathematics from USC, but he just decided he didn't want to, be a college professor. So we have a little oddball. But during one of the meetings we had, one of my constituents came up to me, and he comes from a very wealthy Malibu family. He was a lifeguard, and then he got into urchin diving. He made a better decision than you did, Paul. Anyway, he walks up. It was a workshop, and he walks up to the map, and he points to a place there in Malibu. And he says, "See that, Bob?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "My house is right there. And I don't want an MPA there because I get up and I go out and I dive lobsters right there."
All right, benefits are most likely to be observed most quickly for those species that have small ranges and that have relatively short lifetimes. right? So which are the species then that you might think where we would see evidence of benefits earliest, and which are some of the ones that might take decades? Steve?
I would say some of the rockfish species that are more residential, they'll stay there, they'll become more larger and, more fecund, and I think they'll benefit, but it is those species that transit in and out, probably won't see so much of a benefit. Invertebrates, I've heard that lobster in some areas is doing well, and others maybe not, but it's more the localized species that will stay there, because if they're in a reserve and they don't go out, it is common sense, they're probably gonna get bigger than anywhere else. They're gonna live longer, and but I would say the reef-dwelling fish, and it's a little harder for abalone because they have to be in close approximation to get gametes to mix, and so you'd actually have to have them self-replenish right there in probably the MPA. But I would say the reef fish would be, you wouldn't see much from the transitory type species that are, nothing like, sharks, white sea bass, yellowtail, things like that would not really benefit from coastal MPAs.
Any other questions or comments? I want to say, all I want is an area about that size down here, and we could generate industries, a couple of $1 billion a year, at least. Is that asking too much? Put it down here where you don't fish, or nothing lives there. Why is that so hard to get?
Just pull a permit.
Look, you got 50 of these.
Apply for a permit.
All we want is one. Yeah, remember what Peter Huberot said in his 1992 book, California Jobs? He said, sometimes in California it takes longer to get a permit than it took the U.S. to win World War II. All right, who else has a question or a comment? Then we're gonna bring this to a conclusion. Bruce?
Yes, the Act says that not only are we going to protect and conserve and strengthen and enhance, it says that the law allows enhancements and innovation and experimentation so that we can introduce new species and new plants and strengthen the ecosystem. Is that planned for the second 5 years after they get a good baseline and a good change from the baseline?
Right.
Is it too soon to be thinking about enhancements?
We ask our experts.
I mean, honestly, we're so far behind where we're supposed to be at now, literally, that to try to add another wrinkle to it. And part of the issue is it used to be, Fish and Game traditionally managed fisheries, and it was, I'm going to oversimplify it because I'm not a scientist, but we'd count the fish, we'd figure out a total allowable catch, and then we would send people out to enforce that. And it worked quite well for many fisheries. This is a totally different thing for us. And to get people who, I started working for the state in '82, came to the department in '92, about the same time as Steve, and it's weird to look around and find that there's not a lot of people that came on, before you. But so some of those things are hard to change. Like, this is what we've always done. There was no need to do outreach. We knew we knew how many lobster were there, and that's a really flat fishery, and we're doing a great job. So a lot of this is you're going to see, and there's no clear agency in charge. We've got Ocean Protection Council. We've got private money coming in, private organizations, fishermen, everybody wanting a piece of it. And the department has some legal things to do, but not complete control over everything. So this has been a really tough year, or a series of years, trying to figure out how do all these people work together, in what kind of framework, so that otherwise you're not going to, somebody's got to make a decision at some point. Hey, what are we going to allow, what are we not going to allow? Some of that's not even clear who can do it. We're seeing that in permits we're trying to do up north for some work. It's not clear what we can even permit in an MPA, and who has the authority, whether it's our commission or whether it's an apartment. I mean, it's a serious legal issues that we're grappling with. But again, we're not that far into it, so I think it'll smooth out. But
When did the primary goal become enhancing fish stocks? That was never the original intent, was it?
For the Marine Life Protection Act? No, it was more about biodiversity and habitat
We
conservation.
rarely talk about that anymore. Why is that?
From the act itself? Well, I mean, I think some people thought of it as a fisheries tool, but it's not. It
Doug
is
has
not
the
meant for
answer.
that.
I have a question.
It's unrelated, I want to hear your answer.
Okay, that's fine.
I don't, if you look at our fisheries management plans, and that is another issue that's come up, even because lobster's going through it right now. Where's our credit? The fishermen want to know, where's our credit for the MPAs? Well, again, we don't have the monitoring, so they've lost. I mean, if you're a fisherman, I've lost habitat, but I'm not getting credit, immediate credit, for the total allowable catch, in my quota. So it is a big, big shift. And
I think part of the public education really has to be to move the center of gravity back to what the original intent was in biodiversity and productivity. Bob, and then Doug has a question.
Well, just real quick, one of the things that people have to understand is you don't really manage fish. You manage the people's effect on fish, whether it's a fisherman, whether it's a sightseer going out and looking at whales, whether it's the waste disposal that runs into our ocean, the non-point pollution that we have. Every time we have a good steady rain, there's more oil that goes into the water than you can possibly imagine. And it's because we have all these people scattered here in Southern California. It makes it very difficult. But one of the biggest problems this state has right now, and so I'm going to out myself here, I'm going to be one of the few Republicans that's going to say this, but I think term limits were a terrible idea. And I'll tell you why. You got rid of professional politicians, and now you have amateur legislators. And it really shows that some of the stuff that's coming out of Sacramento, which is absolute junk legislation. There are laws that need to be written, but most of these laws that are coming out there don't need to be written, and so many of them are written so poorly. And then they have to go back and do cleanup legislation, and they have to have court cases where a judge finally has to step in and go, no, this part's okay, that part isn't. Anyway, that's, I wish Richard was here for that.
Doug, you had a question.
Yeah, in listening to all of this and what you're trying to accomplish, an incredible culture change in the way that the bite, in fact, all of the ocean off of California is managed. And I can't help but think that it's very, very difficult to make that culture change, that for the following kinds of reasons. You did it way differently before, and it seemed a lot simpler. There are skill sets that you guys may have or have learned, but all the people underneath you that are expected to make this work maybe don't have those skill sets, and probably some at least are resistant to the even doing of this for all kinds of reasons. I think of what goes on in higher education these days when they say to professors, you need to present student learning outcomes and do it at the course, program, and institutional level. And a lot of people say, we can wait this one out. I'm wondering what you think the chance of success for this is, with dwindling resources on top of all that, and what's the game plan to make this part of the way it's done in the future?
Anybody want to talk about that?
a lot comes from the top. We have a director that knows that you can't do it the way you did it before, and it's forced. I don't know how many people from Fish and Game have ever come to the aquarium. I mean, and it's right here, and we got a regional office down there. I mean, we've come to visit, but to come and participate, and this is a huge, we should be here recruiting. And it took us a little while to figure it out, right? But again, it goes back to you just like stay in that comfort zone, and that's what we did before. And there's a lot, as agencies, we're running out of money, and we're gonna have even less. And in order to get things done, we're gonna have to cooperate with other people. So I think there's people that are locked onto it, but there's change coming, and it's never gonna happen overnight. Part of just the way we're structured, there's people that have been doing a certain thing for a long period of time and feel that information is really critical, and it may be, and you gotta evaluate what's worth scrapping to move and to accommodate this new stuff or different things. And I don't know how many different funding sources the department has, and to try to make sure that everybody's working exactly on those funding sources so you can survive an audit. So if I've got some MPA dollars, I can't take that person if I got an emergency somewhere else and move them to do a different task. So funding is huge, but I think we are changing. And just the fact that we're out having meetings and participating and trying to work with constituents before we get in front of our commission, before things get to the legislature, because oftentimes if we haven't done that, we get stuff that's just really not workable for anybody.
But it is a slow process, even within organizations, let alone societies. We're going through this with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. I'm on the Science Advisory Board, and it doesn't matter who the next president is next in a couple of weeks. We're going to have a new administrator of NOAA. She's looking for a job. And it's interesting that the career people, their attitude is every new administrator comes in and he or she wants to change the culture. They have a bold vision. And the people who are career bureaucrats, their attitude is they're going to be here for 4 to 8 years. We can wait them out. Let's just hunker down. And that organization so desperately needs to change. And even the people who hunker down will say, we've got to change. But
there's one, we used to have a very small volunteer program, and the climate was right. That's expanded out huge. I think we're like 200, 300 volunteers statewide in a program that's continuing to grow and do all kinds of things for the department that people would have been really skeptical about before, doing MPA outreach or doing logistical things that to help the department out be more efficient. And that to me shows there is a change in that we're opening the doors and saying, hey, we need help, we need support, and I don't think there's any employees that are crazy if they think they're going to get worked out of a job. We got way too much to do, so no volunteers or help is going to come along that's going to take our jobs away.
So one final word, then we're going to let you go. So where we started a week ago is that given the fact that this is the place with the greatest concentration of oceanographic research, much of it centered in San Diego, but also up in Los Angeles, it has the largest concentration of marine technology industries anywhere in the United States, and probably anywhere in the world, most of which are around San Diego. You have this forgiving piece of ocean where the water gets replaced every few days. You have all of these assets. Wouldn't it be wonderful for California to become the international leader in showing how knowledge and technology can protect our coastal and ocean ecosystems and can also be used to have appropriate uses of the ocean that are not in conflict with healthy oceans ecosystems, but would stimulate the ocean economy. And that's what we want to keep pushing on. And all right, we'll go down. We'll start with you. Anybody have a last word you want to pass on to this group?
Go ahead, Steve.
Good move, Bob.
I'll just say that I got involved in the process because we needed the support on the Marine Life Protection Act. It was another assignment the department, like Paul said, we had to do. I was involved with other fisheries and investigations. And I was skeptical myself, and I'm not still sure how it's all going to shake out. But I have to say, this process I was in, this Marine Life Protection Act initiative process, was pretty amazing. I mean, it would have never happened if we didn't have the process, and, you know, there's drawbacks to it, but I'm actually kind of proud that I took part in it, and I'm even, it's more of a reassuring feeling when I get people from Italy calling me, like I said earlier, from these other countries, and they've observed our process. Even Australia has created the biggest one, largest single one. They've got their constituents all up in arms about the management of that, and they're saying, geez, how did you do it in California? You know, we got people who want to shoot each other on the boat, and you guys did it. And so it gives me encouragement, it gives me a feeling that it's in the right direction, I'm hoping, you know. And my family's from a fishing background on the East Coast, and I know about fisheries, and you know, sometimes in the process people say, oh, you're a tree hugger, or you know, you're a scientist, you don't know anything, but you do have to compromise. But I was glad I was part of the process, and proud to say that I was, and I'm hoping that we do reap some benefits for everybody.
Paul?
I kind of entered the process through a strange way. I mean, from the enforcement side, it was just thrust on us, and then now I'm kind of involved in the implementation side and seeing a whole different side of it. And it's exciting to know that there is so much interest in the ocean. I mean, to me, that's been the most rewarding thing. And then to meet a lot of people, maybe differing views or differing philosophies, but they could come together and we come up with something. I'm sure we know it could be improved upon. And it'll be interesting to see how it goes. We've seen pretty good compliance, and people, you know, there was winners and losers and some in between, but we haven't seen a lot of people just out defying it. And I think that the more we educate people and they take ownership of the MPAs in their area, those will be the ones that are successful. The ones that are out there where nobody's paying attention and they're ignored, there's no amount of enforcement that's going to take care of it. So,
Bob, you get the benediction.
Okay. Well, right now, as a result of this process, we have several collaborative research projects going on. We have two with lobsters, one of which the department's involved in. And the fishermen are actually going out and doing the data collection, and then they're turning this information into the scientists, and they're evaluating it. There's another one that's just starting up, and then we've been working on one for. There's a small one with sea urchins down in San Diego. We're working on another one up in Northern California, and I stopped off about 3 months ago at the Long Lab in Santa Cruz, UC Santa Cruz, and talked to some of the scientists there. And so we're, you know, this type of the scientists are now finding out, okay, maybe the fishermen can collect data. And it's a much more efficient way because we're out there anyway, we have the boats, but there has to be trust, mutual trust. So when I give the scientists this data, I'm hoping that this is real science, this is biology, this is oceanography. You know, the political science, in case you haven't noticed, I can spot that pretty well. I have that part down. So anyway, and you know, it is kind of exciting. When this whole process started, Jerry, I could barely turn a computer on. But what a weapon it is.
Turned you into a dangerous man. How about a nice round of applause?